Is this me?
I'd like to call this meeting of the Public Services Committee, Monday, November 14th, 2011, to order. First item on the agenda would be review and approval of minutes dated September 12th, 2011. I need a motion, please.
Move approval, Aguilar.
Second, Brown.
Okay, those motions have been made. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. And to move forward, we have reports and updates today. The first report and update will be the zoo agreement update. I believe we have Dave Fisher, the Assistant Parks Director, assisting our City Attorney and City Finance Office.
Good afternoon, Dave Fisher with Parks and Recreation. Appreciate your time today, councilors. We want to take this opportunity to bring the committee up to speed on where we've gotten to in the process of negotiating a new zoo agreement. With me today are several members of our negotiating team. Karen Leonard from the City Attorney's Office, Director Turback from Finance, and Elizabeth Whaley, the President and CEO of the zoo. To give you a little bit of background on the zoo agreement, the existing agreement has been in place since 2006. It was amended in 2010, and it expires at the end of 2011. In addition, an internal audit was completed on the zoo agreement in February of 2011. Our negotiation team has met over the last several weeks to work towards a new agreement that keeps the basic responsibilities of the city and the society the way they are, or the way they have been over the last 5 years. We feel like that situation has worked very well. The zoo is much improved over the last 5 years, and so there's no intent to change those basic responsibilities. What we did look to do is to clarify areas that may have been somewhat gray, and also to incorporate some of the information gained through the internal audit. We've provided you with a summary. We provided you with a summary of the more important bullets of our negotiations, along with a resolution that we plan to propose in conjunction with the agreement. I'd like to walk the committee through the summary bullets and then discuss feedback and questions by the committee, if that's acceptable.
Please carry on.
The term of the proposed agreement is an additional 5 years that would run through December 31st, 2016. This time period also runs concurrent with the AZA accreditation cycle. Ownership of the live animal collection would be transferred to the Zoological Society for the time that the society manages the zoo. This provision would allow the society to manage the live animal collection pursuant to AZA standards in an efficient and effective manner. A resolution transferring the live animal collection is proposed to be presented to the City Council in conjunction with the management agreement. Through the agreement, if the society no longer manages the zoo, the animal ownership would then revert back to the city. We discussed this point at length amongst our negotiation team because it was something that was raised through the internal audit. But after we had discussed it, what we determined is that the goal needed to be that we needed to create a situation where the animals could be managed on a daily basis by the experts that are trained and educated to do so. And so this is the way that we're proposing it today, or will be proposing it in the agreement, achieves that goal, as well as the goal of clarifying the legality of ownership of the animals. The agreement also creates better distinction for the funds that would become the property of the city versus the society in the event the society no longer manages the zoo. Generally speaking, all funds that are intended for the daily operation of the zoo and for projects and programs at the zoo would become the property of the city. Any of those funds that would be outside of that purview and not specific to the Great Plains Zoo and Delbridge Museum site would become the property of the society. New donor agreements, as they're negotiated by the zoo, would also contain agreed upon language so that with those agreements, it's predetermined by the donor, or with the input of the donor, what would happen to their donation should the society no longer manage the zoo. It's also the intent of the agreement that the cost of the general liability insurance coverage for the society as proposed would be transferred to the society. The city paid the general liability insurance costs in previous agreements because some time ago it was difficult for the zoo to get the insurance. It was easier for the city to get it and for the society to then reimburse the city. By correcting this provision makes this agreement more consistent with other management agreements. At this point, we're still working through that, but the zoo is looking at is in the process of obtaining quotes to be able to determine the feasibility of the zoo obtaining the insurance. The society would now also be responsible for providing secondary automobile liability insurance to cover society employees and volunteers operating their own personal vehicles on authorized society business. The actual employee or volunteer's personal insurance would be primary. This too falls in place better with how we deal with other agreements. This agreement also takes into consideration the recommendations of the audit that was recently completed by the internal auditors. Specifically, the agreement provides that the society provide to the city on an annual basis the IRS 990 form. The animal ownership issue, which I've already explained, is being proposed to be addressed through the resolution. An annual report would also be submitted to both the City Council and the Parks and Recreation Board. The timeline for approval of the agreement is such that the Park Board will review some of the same information at their meeting tomorrow. And then the Zoo Society would review the information Wednesday, November 16th. We would plan to return to the council to the informational meeting on Monday, November 21st, at which point we would have a copy of the actual agreement. Finally, we intend to bring the agreement to the full City Council on December 5th for action. And with that, that's the presentation. We'd be happy to try to answer any questions or comments you might have and to take your input.
Any questions? Councilor Aguilar?
With the transfer of the animals and the liability insurance, would that, if they took over the liability insurance, would that then cover if there was anything that happened with someone at the zoo and one of the animals? I mean, would the city still have any type of liability concerning those animals if an animal was to, say, bite a child or whatever?
The primary insurance would belong, or coverage would belong to the zoo and their policy.
But the city could still be held liable?
Well, I think probably from a legal aspect, you'd never say never in terms of that we couldn't be held liable, but.
On that, could I ask a question on that also, Dave? Wouldn't the city be indemnified in that contract similar to what you do with your sporting groups?
Right, that's correct.
That is correct. And to answer your question, Ms. Aguilar, we could get named in a lawsuit because it is our facility, and that would be sorted out through the indemnification provisions that are provided, and then it would have to be sorted out as to whether or not there was any negligence on the part of the society's employees, or if there was any city involvement in that, and ultimately, depending on the facts, one or both could be liable.
The purchasing of the animals, does that sometimes come out of funds that are raised through the zoo and their fundraising, or is it part of usually the management contract, the dollars that we provide?
I'm
Or a
going to
mixture
answer
of
part.
both?
I'm going to answer part of that, but I'll maybe ask Elizabeth to comment on it too. But what we would be proposing in this agreement as we go forward is that animal purchases after the original gifting of the animals to the society for the length of the agreement, additional purchases would be made by the zoo with non-city funds. Anything to add?
Any other questions? Councilor Offenbach?
Well, does that beg the question then that eventually the city won't own the animals at all?
No, at the point that the agreement either expires or is terminated, the ownership of the animals would automatically revert back to the city. So the ownership of the animals is only given to the Zoo Society during the time that they're under contract to manage the zoo.
Even those animals, though, that they purchase with private funds? I mean, if I give $100,000 to buy a whatever, I'm going to expect that, right? Am I going to have that expectation as a donor or is that part of your donor agreements then that I'm donating the money to buy a whatever, but in the donor agreement it says if the society no longer runs the zoo, that whatever animal reverts to the ownership of the city? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, from this point forward with this agreement, any animal that's purchased, even if a donor gave money to buy some exotic animal, by the agreement, that animal would be property of, or would be owned by the society, but that ownership would automatically revert back to the city. So I think, that's probably something that would need to be talked about up front with the donor, and that's what we talked about in terms of future agreements addressing that answer or that question of if the society does or ceases to manage the zoo, what happens to my donation, whether it's money for an animal or an exhibit or a car or whatever.
Right, exactly. And that's when
Yeah.
I read that was what I thought of was the other things, the physical things. I wasn't thinking animals, so okay, thank
Sure.
you.
Councilman Brown?
Question for Elizabeth, please. So today, in practice, do you have donors buying the animals for you today?
We haven't had donors specifically buy specific animals, but we certainly have donors that are interested in our conservation work, our research work, our education programming, all sorts of things. I think typically when we think of the zoo and giving at the zoo, we think of those large exhibits, but there are lots of program pieces that we're very blessed to have funded by individual donors.
My only concern is I wouldn't want us to get in a situation that might handicap you. Elizabeth, I'm going to give you $100,000 to buy some sort of animal, but I don't want the city to own it. Do you foresee any trouble with donors donating money if they know that the society in the end may not own that animal?
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful to provide the society with the latitude to run the very best zoo for our community that we can. And that includes creating relationships, cultivating relationships that end in that private investment that, as you look at the last 5 years or 6 years at the zoo, has really built our zoo. We've been very fortunate and have worked very hard to create relationships with corporations and private individuals that have really expanded not only our exhibits but our programming at the zoo. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we don't handicap the zoo in some way by the animals coming back to the city. does it or does it not?
You know, that's the what if at the end of the day. And I think it's healthy for us to remember that this contract addresses a huge what if. And that what if is, what if we break up? What if we can't manage the zoo together in a great partnership? And I believe that's where we were about 6 or 7 years ago. We don't want to get there again. We didn't have a healthy zoo. We didn't have an attendance driver for our community. We know what a healthy zoo looks like, and we want to maintain that. And so in the case that we were to break up, the agreement does say that the animals would go to the city. But I think until that time, the society has the ability to manage the animals in a way that's appropriate for those animals and for the institution. And so as we look at about 550 animal transactions a year, I believe it would really be burdensome to the council to have all of those have to come before you for approval. I also think that, you know, making decisions on all sorts of transactions, not just sales and transfers, but, you know, should this animal be released back into the wild? That's also a disposition that the AZA clearly says should live with the director of the zoo.
So it really needs to remain with the society, otherwise it could affect your accreditation?
Absolutely. It clearly states both in the AZA's acquisition and disposition policy and in the accreditation standards that that decision-making needs to live with the people whose expertise it is.
But it doesn't speak to reverting back to the city if the relationship goes away.
It doesn't. It does stipulate that we, as managers of the zoo, can confidently understand and agree with the outcome that might happen to those animals. And so we've built into the contract a 90-day period. If we were to get divorced from the city, the society has promised to stick around for 90 days to make sure those animals go to their best next place. And I think that's about the best we can do.
Councilor Aguilar?
How are members of your trustees? Your trustees of the society, how are they chosen? And what is the approval process for that?
Well, there are two different sets of board members. We have 3 mayoral appointments, and those are appointed by the mayor and attend our monthly board meetings. We also have Don Kearney, the Director of Parks, who attends our monthly board meetings and attends our executive committee meetings. The others are chosen by the executive committee through a nominating process and voted on by the full membership of the board.
How many total members do you have?
We have seats for 21, 3 of which are mayoral appointments.
And do all of these type of issues go before your board of trustees, or are they more staff decisions that are made?
Well, individual disposition of animals is a staff situation. That, again, I think our board members would find it burdensome to have to approve 550, transactions of should this duck go to Cleveland, and they really aren't tuned into what kind of holding Cleveland might have or what kind of genetics Cleveland might have, to provide a new family for that duck or whatever. And so those are made by staff that are very highly qualified to make those decisions. And I'm just going to take this opportunity to talk about what a great, highly professional, well-trained staff we have. We have been so blessed to be able to recruit really high-level zoo professionals, including our Director of Animal Programs, who came from Mizzou Atlanta and has really moved our program forward. But that includes 37 professionals of all types, from our maintenance staff to our bookkeeping staff to a staff vet and all sorts of other people that take care of our guests.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Aguilar? Or excuse me, Irfenbach?
We don't
Guys are
look
just
that
too
much
close.
alike.
It's the glasses.
It's the glasses. Well, I'm just looking at all the whereases in the animal ownership thing, and I don't disagree. We've got awesome zoo staff, and what we've seen in the changes in the zoo since Vernon took Emma there one day and went, oh my gosh, and to the point where Elizabeth came on and all of those things. I just wanted to point out, too, because this has been a big topic for us since the internal audit pointed out that we apparently didn't own the animals. And I wanted to point out that state surplus laws also make it difficult for us to own those animals as a city. And so I just think we need to honor both, that idea that state law oversees this, as well as our accreditation as a zoo. Then my thought was, if we did own them, then I would really like you to bring them down here in a trailer so we could look at each one before we trade them off. Would that be all right?
More easily said than done.
Yes. But on a serious note, then I also wanted to ask, I know that we're not looking at the entire agreement, and we won't for a couple of weeks yet. But my question is, because we're talking about it with the pavilion, we're talking about it with all sorts of folks at this point, is naming rights, and are we going to address that in the agreement? And can either of you talk with that?
Sure, I'll give half the answer, and then Dave will give half the answer. I believe that, and we have had a lot of discussion on this. We've been told by the city attorney's office that perhaps a change in the ordinance will be proposed, and the current contract clearly states that we'll abide by all rules and ordinances, and we always have and always will. But I can tell you, since you've asked, as someone who's really worked to build our zoo, I believe that cultivating relationships that sometimes can end in the opportunity for a donor to have their name on a program or an exhibit really is one of the ways that we've built our zoo over the last few years. And we don't intend ever to be a sign graveyard. We don't want to have all sorts of names and signs at the zoo, but we do want to have every opportunity to build our zoo through private investment. And I think we've done a very good job of doing that in the last 6 years, and we hope that we continue to work together and to have some sense of our ability to raise private funding for the zoo and have that conversation really actively with the city before we make such a decision, or before you make such a decision.
Councilor Brown?
At the risk of missing one, Elizabeth, can you run down that list of some of the facilities that you have received naming rights for? Because it's becoming fairly lengthy, is it not?
Well, we have a number of great relationships that may not have ended in exhibit names, but we do have lots and lots of donors who will see their goodwill in our community recognized somehow. And so the name of the zoo hasn't changed. But I can tell you that if you look back at the last 6 years, we've had some really significant help, both from private individuals and from corporate relationships, including a lovely $250,000 gift from Hy-Vee, which really is the only naming opportunity that we've put in place. Although I will tell you there are a couple of other agreements pending, and so we hope to make those gifting announcements soon. But that allowed us to take down the old children's zoo, which was really groaning under its own age. It was a safety issue for our guests and for our animals. It was great when I was a kid, but it was a danger. And now we have the lovely, colorful Hy-Vee Face-to-Face Farm. We had a great relationship and continue to have that relationship with Sanford Health, and they gave us a really wonderful gift of $571,000 for a 5-year relationship that helped us both with infrastructure, bringing the zoo into the current century in terms of technology, but also allowing us to have cameras in our exhibits so that not only can the kids at the Children's Hospital see those animals real time, but our zookeepers can go onto their laptop at home and see if the zebra is ready to give birth or not. And that was really a wonderful gift. $100,000 gift from Walmart was announced this year. We have, I believe we will get to that $1.5 million capital campaign goal shortly. And that's lots of corporate gifts that will be recognized somehow. This is all over and above operating, which we've also built over the last 6 years through the help of individuals, corporations, and the city's management fee has remained static for 6 years. So I hope you agree with me that the city is getting a good deal out of the zoo's work to drive private investment.
Any other questions? I have one from the crowd. Councilman Edelman.
Elizabeth, maybe you can answer this too. There is some questions that have come up. We talk about the animals and the fact that we look at them as a current asset. Okay, so how is the sale tracked if they are tracked? And you said you've had 500 transactions of animals. So the question might be, how are the sales tracked? Who authorizes the sale? And how is the money accounted for?
Let's see if I can get all your points. Well, in terms of the animals being assets, even our financial auditors, Eide Bailly, do not book those as financial assets. The other thing to remember is that these transactions are all constant. It's 550 a year, so every day there are 1 or 2 or 3. In addition to sales, there are loans. There are endangered species breeding loans, which is kind of a strange word to use because no one really owns those animals, those very high-profile, important, and endangered animals. There's also release back to the wild. There's rehabilitation, which is a temporary transaction. There are all sorts of dispositions for these animals. So to your question about how are the finances tracked, absolutely, just like any other receivable that is tracked in our accounting system. It's also tracked in our animal accounting system, which is called ISIS, and that's a database. Both ISIS and MEDARCs are databases that track all of the animals in zoos throughout the country, and so we know absolutely where our animal is and when it arrived and what the state it's in. I'm sure I'm missing a couple of your bullets.
Who authorizes the sale? In other words, if you make that transaction, who determines if that's to be?
The recommendation is made by our animal care staff, but often it's made in conjunction
Excuse me.
with other animals.
Could I have you speak?
Sorry about that. Theater in the round. Sorry. The question was who authorizes that transaction. Initially, that recommendation comes from our animal care staff, but also usually it's made in conjunction with a number of animal care staffs in a number of zoos. If we're looking at endangered species breeding, it's dependent upon the genetics of that species and where that animal best can go to create more of that animal. Usually it's in conjunction with other holding facilities. Who has the holding? Who needs that to mate with its other animal, even if it's not an endangered species. So there are a lot of factors that go into determining when an animal goes and where it goes, but ultimately, according to the acquisition and disposition policy of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, that decision lies with the director of the institution.
Okay, I also have a question from Councilor Rolfing.
I'm sitting here listening to this, and I'm wondering how we did this before when we owned the animals. I see problems coming up here. I'm one of those guys that looks at it and says, how are we going to, if something happens here, how are we going to fix it? And the only way we're going to fix this is if we own the animals. Now, being very cynical, and I don't like to be that way very often, and there's nothing against staff, okay? Because you've done such a fantastic job out there. It's just great. But when you're gone, that's one of the things that we've got to look at. The next person, who may not be the quality person you are, decides that we're a little short next month or for the year, and gee, we do have an extra giraffe. Maybe we should sell it, and maybe we can do something like that and bring things back up. And this is all speculation, whatever, and I'm just saying something tells me that this doesn't feel right, and and if we are going to be the final gun, if you will, with this zoo, the final owners, we also need to own and have some kind of say in what happens to the major asset that is out there, and that is the animals. That's what I've got to say.
Thank you.
Geez, I don't know why this is so hard for you, Counselor. I would just respond to that if I could, in terms of that's why we have mayoral appointments on that board, and that's why we're getting an annual report from them. And I know the Parks Department keeps a pretty stiff watch on what's going on at the zoo. That I don't think is an issue in terms of selling a giraffe off, just for cash flow for this month. I think our concerns are larger than that in terms of overall management, and that AZA accreditation is huge. And so that would be my response to that. I'd have a couple questions in a minute, but Councilor Brown has
Councilor
input
Brown.
too.
If I could address Councilor Rolfing's concern too, the AZA is known internationally, I believe. Is it an international or just national? International organization. They're telling us here that the best practice is for the zoo to operate and take care of the animals, own the animals during that time. And secondly, if we see things going wrong, we can end that relationship, and then we do own the animals.
I understand too, Councilman Rolfing's concerns about the animals, and as a staff, we had, like I say, we talked about this at length, and what gave us a little more comfort in that regard is that we do have seats on the executive board and on the board, and now, as much as anything, we also have staff located directly at the zoo on a daily basis, because we're now in charge of the maintenance outside of the exhibits. So basically, that gave us a little better comfort level in terms of if something was going to disappear, we've got folks on site 365 days a year. So those are maybe just a couple things that helped us as a staff warm up to that, to the transfer of the ownership.
Councilor Aguilar?
I guess going back to something you said, Elizabeth, that your auditors do not look at the animals as an asset. So then why do we have to surplus them in this agreement if they're not considered an asset?
Karen Leonard from the City Attorney's Office, and we thought of that question as well. And so I was tasked with researching whether or not zoo animals are personal property and do the surplus laws apply to this type of asset, so to speak, because we knew Ide Bailey did not inventory them. We know that our finance department does not keep them on their books, and we don't have them on our books. But having said that, City of Sioux Falls and Watertown are the only two cities that run a zoo in the state of South Dakota. And quite honestly, there was nothing definitive in state law to say that they weren't. And so the conservative approach was a recommendation made when we were negotiating this is there is a chance that they could be considered personal property because other zoos do treat them as personal property. And the legislature isn't all that clear about zoo animals in their definition of personal property. And so we said it's better to be safe and treat them as personal property and go through this rather than to have a determination made later that you weren't following the procedure. So this is an extra precaution to go ahead and run this resolution, surplus them to the society. And if I could just take one more minute to answer Council Member Rolfing's questions, which are really good. I really appreciate those because I also had the same concerns that he did, and it was very important that as a negotiating team we came in and discussed that we needed checks and balances in place, because that's really, we have a duty to the public when we have tax dollars to make sure that there is a check and balance in place. So there's three things in the contract that you're not aware of, but one is that we put in that if they are managing our animals, that they have a fiduciary duty to take care of those animals, and it will be a direct right for the city to terminate the agreement should that duty be breached. The second thing is the AZA accreditation standards. That would jeopardize their ability to stay accredited if they were not managing the animals appropriately underneath the AZA standards. And third, we put in the contract that we can, upon request, ask at any time a snapshot inventory of what they have out there. And through the ISIS system, Elizabeth is able to produce that for the city. So we felt that we did put in checks and balances into the agreement to make sure that that fiduciary duty is carried out by the society.
Councilor Ruffenbach?
Karen, is there something headed for the legislature, possibly maybe through Municipal League, regarding zoo animals? Do you know that off the top of your head? Tracy, I know we talked about it.
Tracy?
I'm totally spinning this just because when you said that, I just thought there's something coming out of Municipal League, isn't there?
We did ask Tracy to submit something, and I'll let him take it.
Okay.
Tracy Turback with Finance. The Municipal League has included in their statement of policy for this year a position that would support a change to the surplus property laws that would change how municipalities can transfer assets or surplus property to nonprofit organizations that would kind of encompass this situation that we have here. And it would, and I think in some ways, help to clarify how we can manage those kinds of assets.
So help me understand then, when it says municipal league policy statement, it's not binding by law in any way. Do we have a responsibility to find someone to sponsor this? Do we want to make this happen, to make this a little easier on us in the future?
That's part of the role of the municipal league, is to take that policy and then find a legislator that's willing to sponsor that kind of legislation, and certainly any prodding that they get from their membership is certainly helpful in that regard.
Did you hear that? Prodding from the membership. I think this is maybe one that we need to follow up on.
One of our
Legislative.
priorities.
Councilor Aguilar?
I have a question now on naming rights. With the Hy-Vee face-to-face, so, and I had this question in negotiation with another management group. Is it written into the agreement then if the society were no longer managing the zoo? Does that name still apply, or would the next management group have the ability to come in and change it? Because it's nothing, the city hasn't approved it. You know, it's been approved, I take it, by your trustees. And I was just wondering how that agreement works.
That's part of that donor language that we intend to put together as a negotiation team and make sure that, I believe that'll come before the council as well, the language that we intend to put into our agreements with our sponsors going forward, so that it's very clear how they intend their gift to be used, how it will be recognized, all of those things.
So right now, though, I mean, because the Hy-Vee is in place, was that for
That
ever?
actually is a 5-year agreement.
Oh, 5 years, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee or the floor? Dave, would you like to finish up? Do you have any other comments? Or?
I'd just like to thank the entire negotiating team, because like I say, we've spent several weeks talking about this stuff, and I think that when it got finally to the end, particularly with regard to the animals, I mean, where we ended up being was we really need to do this. We've got such a great start after 5 years, our previous 5-year agreement. We really need to set ourselves up with a situation that where we can continue to provide an outstanding zoo. And part of that is the animals need to be managed by the folks that are the experts in that field. And so it was a team effort, and appreciate the council's input.
Thank you, Dave. Councilor Urfenbach?
I just wanted to add one more really kind of dumb question. When we talk about the AZA accreditation, is it the society that's accredited, or is it the zoo itself, or is it, how is that? Or is the society and the zoo the same thing? She's rolling her eyes. That's great.
Really what the answer is. You know, I think when we think of the society, that's the nonprofit organization that manages the zoo. The city contracts with the society to manage the zoo. But when we think about the Great Plains Zoo, it's not only the physical space that's owned by the city, it's a living, breathing organization that has educational programming, it has conservation efforts, it has all sorts of things that really provide great richness to the community, and that's what's accredited by the AZA. And so if those programming and educational pieces go away, it's really just simply a bunch of buildings on a piece of land, but it's not a zoo the way zoos are defined today.
Right, exactly. And it's an awesome zoo. It really is.
Thank you.
Thanks for your work.
Thank you for all your help.
Councilor Brown?
And Elizabeth, that's a good segue to a preview. You've got someone from the AZA coming to see us soon, right?
We do. We have Chris Veers, who's the executive director of the AZA, coming to talk with you folks at the informational meeting on December 5th. Interesting timing, I realize, but I think you'll find her delightful and very informative. And of course, she views our zoo up against 220-some other zoos throughout the country. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say to all of us, and I'm excited for her to see our facility up close. Obviously, through the accreditation process, they went through reams of information. They had a visit of a team of 3 experts that took all sorts of pictures and made reports, but it'll be fun to have Chris out here because I don't think she's been out here.
And I would just end with, I reread the internal audit report, and the fact that we have 70% increase in our attendance at the zoo is just a huge testament to you and your staff, Elizabeth. So thank you for your work.
My pleasure, absolutely. Thank you for all your help.
And I guess I just have a question also. I heard on the news the other morning that a certain species of rhino is now being considered extinct in the wild. Is it a black tip rhino, I believe?
There is a subspecies of the eastern black, I believe, or of the black rhino that now is no longer found in the wild. And so, you know, we're working very hard. That's a specific species that we're working very hard to keep on the planet. And the kind of rhinos that we have here at the zoo, the eastern black rhino, we're down to about 2,500 in the wild. People who have cared, field biologists and others like us, have now built that population up to about 3,500 in the wild. But let's remember that there were hundreds of thousands running across Africa just, you know, a few decades ago. And we've got so many species that are leaving the planet at an alarming rate. Our world truly is changing if we don't care and do something about it. And that's really the educational piece that we need to remember about zoos today. If our kids don't care about these species, our world really will change, and not for the better.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Just a comment. I'm with Councilor Erpenbach. I think we should have animals here when Elizabeth comes.
Don't you think? Don't you think like monkeys and stuff? It'd be really fun. It'd be like Johnny Carson in the old days.
Would you really like some animals for the December 5th or
Sure.
for the November 21st?
Yes.
If you would like that, I think you're talking to the right girl.
Indulge us. Indulge us a little
If you're
bit.
serious,
Yeah.
be careful what you wish for. Remember what happened to Johnny Carson's hair a lot of the time? I don't know. If you
Thank
want,
you.
we can do it.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank
I think
you.
that the zoo is a great integral part of the city and is also with the breeding programs very important to, you know, keep that wildlife out there so that people actually get to see what they look like. Thank you. Next agenda item will be an amendment to ordinance 14-85, increasing the time between the annual city election and the runoff election from 2 to 3 weeks. We'll have Sue Rouse explain.
Thank you very much. Sue Roust, interim city clerk. Thank you, Chairman Anderson and council member or committee members. What I'm bringing to you today, it should have more accurately said amendment to ordinance section 14-85. And this would be a proposal to change the time between the annual election and the runoff from 2 to 3 weeks. And there are several reasons why that's advisable. Number one, when it's only 2 weeks between elections, the registration deadline for the runoff has passed before the date of the election, and it's very frustrating for voters to go to their polling place and be told, well, you're not registered for this election, we can give you a registration form, you can fill it out, but you won't be registered for the next election either. Since the deadline is 15 days, a 3-week gap would give them time to get registered. Secondly, it's very difficult in a 2-week time period to get ballots printed, get them, the ballot boxes packed, get the supplies out to the precincts again. It's also very difficult for the county auditors who've had a 2-week buildup of voter registrations and have to enter a bunch of new registrations before reprinting their registration books to get them out. It makes it very difficult for absentee voters who are away and are getting their ballots by mail. By the time the ballots are printed and sent out to them and they get them back, sometimes it's difficult for them to get that 2-week turnaround. And a more philosophical issue, but one that I feel strongly about, is when we have a crowded field in the initial contest and that gets winnowed down to 2 left. Sometimes I think 2 weeks is a very short time for those 2 candidates to get their message out to the voters. Sometimes they're not able to distinguish themselves from the pack in the first election, and a 3-week time frame, philosophically, I believe, would leave them a little more time. Councilor Anderson, when I requested to have this on the agenda, asked me to provide some history and to provide perhaps what the thinking was in developing our current ordinance. And that took a lot of research to get back to. But if you will bear with me on a little history lesson, I will give that to you. If you look at the current Section 14-85 in our ordinances, it says that it was passed in November of 2007. But this ordinance originally was put on the books in October of 1998. And I'll get to how it ends up showing as a new ordinance in 2007 when it truly is not. In 1998, the city followed state law, which said that if a person did not get a majority vote in the initial city election, there would be a runoff election 2 weeks later. And in that 1998 election, circumstances occurred under which many people felt that there shouldn't have been a runoff. It was a waste of time. What happened was we did not have slots at that time, and so in 1998 there were 2 seats for the at-large position, and the law said you have to get 50%. There were 3 people running. Mathematically, it is impossible for 2 people to get 50% of the vote when you've got 3 candidates. We had 2 candidates, Tam Baker and Bob Jamison, who both got well over 40% of the vote, and a third candidate who got less than 15%. The same 3 candidates had a runoff 2 weeks later. The results were the same, and Jamison and Baker were elected. That is why the first part of this election is there that the previous section is the one that it would be 1484 that talks about the slotting of the A and B slots. So now when we have 2 at large, they're up. The other thing that happened was in council district races, sometimes it was difficult to get the 50%. That's what it said at that point. There also was a 2-year at-large position that year. 4 candidates, one of them got 48.3% of the vote in the first election. And so once again, there was a runoff 2 weeks later that pretty much had the same results. And after that time, the city council talked about it at length, and both passed Section 14, what now is Section 1484, that put in the slotting whenever there are 2 at-large positions, and also set the threshold for a win for a council member at 34%. And it's interesting that the next election after that, in the year 2000, there was one race with 3 people, and nobody got 34%. So just a historical note. So anyway, this was passed in 1998. And then one other thing, and in 2002, just because this is something that I've just realized today, in 2002 there was an ordinance passed relating to quite a few election procedures. It had a lot to do with campaign finance, but it also added the requirement that candidates file a notice of intent with the city clerk before a person becomes a candidate. You've seen this, you've all filled it out. When I came in this fall, this is one that's always puzzled me because it's not required by any other level of government that I'm aware of in the state of South Dakota, only by the city of Sioux Falls. When I started here, I read through the ordinances and I said, where is the authority for requiring that? There is nothing in current ordinance that requires this notice of intent. So I thought, okay, what's going on? Well, and then we have the problem of how this statute looked like a brand new statute. One more thing before we get to that. In 2006, there was a state law passed to change the runoff from 2 weeks to 3 weeks. It was proposed by legislators from Rapid City. At that time, this law only applied to cities of over 25,000. Well, the city of Sioux Falls interpreted that they were under a home rule charter, were not subject to that law, and so it was only for Rapid City. But that law was passed with the same exact rationale as I've given you, the reasons why you should go to 3 weeks. So then we come to 2007. The City Council did an extensive reworking of your campaign finance laws. I've read back through the minutes of the Public Services Committee. Some of you were on it. I think you can remember that. And it went on for a long time, and it resulted in Ordinance 182-07. Nowhere in any of the minutes can I ever see any mention of this part of the statute having to do with the runoff. But when the dust settled and this ordinance was adopted, several key sections of statute were renumbered, and they included the one about notice of intent, and the one about slotting of the at-large spots, and the one about the council members needing 34% or there's a runoff 2 weeks later. As to the thinking of why it was left at 2 weeks later when state law had been changed to 3 weeks, I don't know. I talked to the city clerk at various times over the past several years and suggested that that's something the city might look at, because it's always an issue every time you have a runoff, and it apparently was not an item of interest. So as far as the thinking of why we never considered it, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that in the renumbering of sections, this section on the notice of intent that a person would file before becoming a candidate was simply wiped out. It was written over with a new statute. And the two about the slotting and the 34% were moved to the very end of a statute that all the rest of it was about campaign finance. The very last two sections on about page 16 of it are these two sections. So this is really from 1998, and it still says a 2-week runoff. I believe that in the interest of good election management and of giving the voters the best possible information, that it would be advisable to consider going to 3 weeks before the runoff. If you were willing to forward this to the council, it could go to the council on December 5th for a first reading, December 12th for a second reading. It would be effective in early January, which I believe would be in time to inform all candidates for 2012 that this is coming. So that is my proposal. As far as that notice of intent, I apologize for not finding it sooner, but we have been looking and looking, trying to figure out statutes, and finally today I figured out what happened to that one. You have used that. I think it's been popular, but I don't know for whom it's most useful. As I said, there's no other level of government that requires that. You know, for instance, a candidate might, or a person interested in running for office who hasn't decided yet if they want to go for the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives, or the State Senate, sometimes will take out 2 petitions. And they aren't raising money yet. They aren't making it public that they're running. But they have the 2 petitions. I could see a person running for city office taking out petitions for the slots A and B of the at-large. As soon as they start collecting money, as soon as they publicly announce that they're a candidate, then they kind of fall under all the campaign finance guidelines and everything. But you have this one extra thing that used to be there about the notice of intent. And so I have no opinion on that one way or another. I just wanted to let you know it's no longer there. Nobody right now is required to file a notice of intent if they want to run for city council or for mayor. So I'll leave that one to you folks to decide if you want to pursue it at all. But I would ask you to consider the changing the runoff to 3 weeks after the first election.
Questions from the committee? Any questions from the floor? Any motions? Councilman.
I appreciate the research that you've done, Sue. It's important stuff and it's all of it's really great arguments. The one for me though is about voter registration. This is about helping people be able to vote, and the more we do to make it easier to register to vote and to participate in the process, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So I would move that we move this amendment on to the full council.
Second, Aguilar.
Any other comments? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will be moving that to be the informational and then first reading on December 5th.
Does it need an informational?
Do we have to do it on an informational though, or just do a first reading on December 5th and with a scheduled second reading on December 12th?
One other question, though, if I might. What does it do to the timing of the swearing in and those kinds of things? Does it matter?
That comes far enough after. I checked the calendar, and it does bring it a week closer, but there's still a gap there.
Okay. Then if I might, Councilor Anderson, a question about the part that disappeared.
Yeah.
Maybe the attorney can speak to that, when something just, it's gone, right?
Councilor Erpenbach, I'm glad I can say I wasn't around when this happened.
It's one of those oops kind of things.
I frankly don't know, and I was listening to the history along with the rest of you today, and we'll see what happened. Obviously, those things occur. From what I understand, in 2007, the city attorney's office was not really involved in that entire process when those amendments were made. So we learned with the rest. I learned with the rest of you just today. So
I would think that maybe the notice of intent was dipping your toe in the pond just to check what the temperature might be for that person running for an election without them having to go through all the official actually setting up and picking up petitions and starting to do fundraising.
But it made it public, you know.
Right.
The only thing I could relate it to, I guess I didn't understand the double petition thing, but when someone's running for president or, you know, U.S. Senate or something, they'll set up an exploratory committee, which is a legal thing. Well, this is kind of like that, but seems a little bit bigger than what we really need to be. I'm okay with it just disappearing, but I just want it to really go away then. But
All right. Well, next thing on the agenda is open discussion. Do we have any items for open discussion? Okay. I need a motion for adjournment then.
second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you for attending. This meeting of the Public Services Committee is now adjourned.